Oh boy, what's up, guys?
Nothing. I just
Yo.
Oh boy,
I'm a little punchy. You
It's
guys,
the wrong-
you guys missed some gold before we started recording here.
it is the wrong attitude to bring to the material.
I know.
Patreon only. You can hear what we recorded before this.
It was about sex addict Yoda.
Yeah, that's all you get—a character concept.
That's all you get. Welcome everybody to the 11th episode of
Wow,
our humble
Wow.
podcast, Spine Crackers.
that's right.
I'm Gabe,
Lucky
the
number 11.
Lance Bass of the group.
Wait. Okay, I'm Matt. You threw that idea at me, so now
You can be anybody you want. It doesn't even have to be from NSYNC or a boy band.
What? Really?
I was just doing it, baby.
All right, I'm Paul.
What do you mean?
The Lance Armstrong of the group.
Okay, now it has to be someone named Lance.
fuck. Who are other Lances? Oh,
Lance. I was about to say
Lance Legstrong. We're gonna
Yeah.
see Lance Legstrong.
Spear leg
leg
strong. Spear leg weak.
I'm Spear Leg Week. No, fuck. Who's the gossip girl that's also a Bass? Chuck Bass. No.
Like from the show Gossip Girl.
Yeah.
I don't know enough characters.
Oh,
I can't.
yeah, it's Chuck Bass.
Right?
That works. You could switch the last name.
Yeah.
You
Right.
could be the Chuck Bass.
I'm Louis Armstrong.
There you go.
Whatever.
I'm Blake Lively. Welcome to Spine Crackers.
There you go, dude. More like Wordsworth dead. I'm doing the name game thing.
Who landed on the moon again?
Well, like Blake
Which
is a poet. So I was like, like something else, like Coleridge Deathly, something like that.
Oh, okay. I see what you're doing.
This is the worst episode we've ever recorded.
The way I do that joke, it would have been more like Pond Deadly or something. Like,
Oh, got you.
Like lake and pond and dead alive.
I got you. It has to be way more like opposites and literal.
More, yeah, that's how I do it. It's
Okay.
It's stupid, and no one thinks it's funny. Nobody likes those tweets, so I think it's funny.
No one gets them.
Yeah, it'll catch on for like 100%.
Yeah, we've been trying to get it to catch on for like 8 years with
Gabe.
the Heath Ledger one.
It hasn't been a concerted effort though. We just need to put more focus on it.
What we need to do is double down. The classic move.
Like explaining your stand-up joke after it fails.
Yeah.
Yes.
1,000
Yeah.
points of light, stay the course, I believe George Bush Sr. said. And that's what you should be doing.
Mhm.
A lot of people telling you you're taking the wrong path. It's not funny. Stop. I'm
Well,
unsubscribing.
Comedy is objective, and they're wrong. So
Yeah.
Fucking true.
Likes
dude.
don't matter. Likes don't matter.
burn more Cockins is funny. That's funny.
It is.
Objectively.
It's math. I don't get it. Yeah, it's just mathematically provable that that's funny.
Yep.
Yeah, that's how jokes are judged. Man.
I sent it to Deep Blue, the chess computer, and he told me it's funny. So
Man, Deep Blue's still kicking around?
probably, I don't know, or Watson, whatever the good one is, well, the new one, the Jeopardy one, Watson.
Yeah, you want the one that can probably beat people at Go as opposed to chess at this point, right?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Viewers or listeners,
If there are any chess and Go podcasts or AI podcasts out there,
there are actually probably 100% those things.
There are
Oh,
probably
yeah, I'm
tons
sure
of
there are.
those, yeah.
Chime in, join us.
we genuinely want to hear from you.
But Paul, I think the ritual now is, since you are the one that chose this book, give us an intro and a brief explanation of why.
Tell us the book.
Yes.
What is it? Who wrote it? What's
Yes.
going on with this book?
You know how it works.
This book The Snow is Dirty or Dirty Snow, depending on which copy you got. Which copies did you guys get?
New York Review of Books.
Dirty Snow.
Dirty Snow.
I got The Snow is Dirty.
Is it the
Ooh.
same translator? I'm curious.
Um,
Does this even say who the translator was, man?
I'm not. Oh, I don't know.
Mine's
It should.
Howard Curtis.
Okay, it's different.
Oh,
my
shit!
God.
Interesting.
Wow. We
That'll be
basically read
fun.
different books.
You
though.
have a? Is that a Penguin edition, Paul?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Penguin Classics. Even better than Penguin Normal.
Right.
But not as
but
good
yeah.
as fucking Pangolin classics.
Oh God. Oh God.
Which is another animal.
It's a whole other animal. It's actually,
Yeah.
incidentally, one of my favorite animals.
A
But
pangolin? Why?
yeah, dude, they're cute.
They are cute. All right, I'm sorry, Paul. What's going on, man? Tell us
Yeah.
all about this book you picked.
Spill the tea, please.
So The Snow is Dirty by George Simenon. Belgian author. I picked it because I wanted to read a Simenon book on the podcast, because the first book we picked for our club was by Simenon. It was Gabe's pick. It was The Widow. And we all gave it 5 bags. It was probably the highest rated book we've... wait, is that true? No, we
No.
didn't.
No.
We gave...
the only book that was been unanimous 5s was The Mountain Lion.
Yes.
That's true. I got him. Yeah, that's right. But we all really liked The Widow, and I was like, I really like this author a lot. So I actually went to my local bookstore in Vermont and found like 20 used copies, like old editions of Simenon book, and I bought like all of them. So I've been slowly reading them, and I wanted to pick one of the ones I bought for the podcast, but they were like all out of the print, and like way too expensive to buy. So
Yeah, you
I
got
had to buy
some.
another one.
You got some, like, incidentally, just not to derail, but just like, Paul, did you pick some like fancy rare book editions? Because you just bought that shelf. Because I saw the shelf
Yeah.
before you bought it, and then you like texted us later with a photo, and you're like, I bought the shelf. And
Yeah, I
like,
bought like tons of them.
what's the most expensive one you got? I'm just curious now.
I don't even know. I haven't really looked them up. But I've looked
Okay.
up some, but some are like hardcovers, and I think
I mean, even that one you gave me for Christmas was like $35-$40 on eBay, I think.
yeah, The Cat, that was a good
Mhm.
one. I read that one. But I picked this one because it was the one I could find that was like still. I don't think it's in print anymore, but we all ended up being able to find it. And I just figured any Simenon book is just good, so I picked it.
I think this one is like, if anyone's interested, I think this one is like one of the more continually printed ones, specifically because, right, like New York Review of Books, I believe like keeps their catalog continually reprinted, but this would be one of the more accessible things to read. I mean, it's got its little afterword by Volman and all that kind of
Oh,
stuff.
I didn't have
so-
one. I didn't have an afterword.
I did not like the afterword. We'll talk about that, I think, but
Okay.
Yeah, actually, I do agree with you on that.
But so the basic premise of this book is like it's about this young French 18-year-old kid living in occupied France, I think, right? Or was it Belgium? I never really got the grasp of where they were.
I think that's part of
I
what
thought
makes
it
it
was-
interesting is that it's a lot of it is
Yeah.
left kind of vague.
Yeah.
And I think it's implied just because of Simenon's own background that it's German occupied France in World War II
Yeah.
or somewhere thereabouts, but nowhere
They
is
never
explicitly
actually-
named. Yeah.
Yeah.
The only reason we come to that conclusion is because it was written in 1948, and it just kind of makes sense that that would be what he was writing about. But it's about a young kid named Frank, who's the son of a brothel owner. His mother, Lotte,
Something like that.
Lurter.
Lot.
she owns a brothel, and he's just kind of like this degenerate 19-year-old kid who has like all this mess of, men coming into the brothel. Just throughout his whole life, he's just kind of living in this like degenerate lifestyle, and it obviously affects his behavior. He starts hanging out with some rough people and gets kind of like a taste for more violent behavioral acts, and ends up killing someone. I think is he the person that kills like the small man within like the first 5 pages?
He kills a big fat
Right.
guy, but
Well, he kills the big fat guy like in the first or second chapter, but I think he like punches a
you're
small
th-
like
you're thinking of so he has this like boastful friend named Kroner,
oh, Kroner
uh
kills him.
who's, I mean, it's not even clear. Kroner's just sort of like
Yeah.
a braggart, so he's just kind of like describing cool shit that he quote unquote did, but like it's never established.
Okay. It always takes me a while to like check into a book, and I always tend to forget like the first 5 pages. But he ends up killing for sure 2 people. Um, and he kind of has this like sort of like this just kind of a spiral into like wanting to be caught, wanting attention, wanting to grow in the ranks of whatever like crime syndicate he's like even imagining is around him. And then the last probably I think it's the last section, or at least like the last few chapters of the book, is him getting picked up by police and being questioned in a some sort of camp or prison place. And yeah,
I mean,
how was that?
that's basically the book's basically divided in half by that, right? There's
Yeah.
basically the first half is him outside the prison, and the second half is him inside the prison.
I have 3 sections in mine.
Well, I'm just saying in terms of like total page count, it's like a roughly half and half.
It seems like
Oh,
it's a 2-act structure basically, and I would say like your description of him is almost charitable in the sense that like I would describe Frank as like a genuine psychopath, like like a damaged and truly terrible person. It seems like based on like the more his background's fleshed out, it seems like that's been true, since birth, or like, there's that weird question of like where does the seed of it begin, but like it's matured and on its inevitable route to, the start to the end of the book by the time we meet him in the first chapter.
Yeah. I mean, the book basically opens with him doing a nonsense killing of like just for no reason. He asks to borrow Cromer's knife and just sort of resolves for basically no reason to kill this I'm just gonna say German, even though it's not, the occupying force is never named. I'm just for
Right.
shorthand, I'm just gonna say German. um Kill this German officer that he sees in the bar one night, and he does. And then he sort of like you said, Paul, he sort of sees one of his, I mean, this whole thing takes place in a sort of unnamed, like seemingly smallish town, or very small city, and in and around Frank's essentially tenement building, sort of a housing complex. And he sees one of his neighbors go by, and he sort of like coughs conspicuously, and almost as if he's sort of trying to get the guy to notice, like, hey, I'm here, and when you hear tomorrow that someone's been murdered here, remember that I was here.
And I think like, so I believe these were his contemporaries, and the immediate comparisons that are always drawn, or that I saw consistently drawn in a couple like reviews and stuff that I was reading, were that, yeah, I mean, Simenon is an incredibly famous, especially at the time, right? Like French,
Belgian,
but well, I mean, like I guess regarded
French-speaking French writer.
culturally French, regarded as French, like
Yeah, yeah.
Parisian kind of person, who had some own, biographically had some questionable status during the Vichy France era of World War II. And so like, yeah, so the assumption, the best model to think about the context of the story, the setting, would be that, I would say. And
Yeah.
and also that like at the same moment, right? Like, wasn't he vying in the same territory as like the existentialists, but a little bit earlier? And that this gets a lot of comparisons to specifically L'Étranger, just for the fact of the kind of pointless killing that starts off the whole story.
I mean, I think one thing that I think is interesting is that, Paul, you mentioned that we had sort of, before we started recording these episodes and we were just doing this for the love of the game, we had read another one of Simenon's novels, The Widow, and that book is directly cited by Camus as being a sort of precursor to The Stranger.
Right.
And The Stranger sort of came out. So that book, The Widow, and this book, Dirty Snow, kind of sandwiched The Stranger in between them. The Stranger came out in 1942. This was 1943, and The Widow was, I think, 41. Maybe even a little earlier. But I think so. Yeah, I think it's interesting that both of these books are compared to The Stranger, which sort of came out in between them.
And The Widow is like my only, now, because of, you know, the book club, it's my only frame of reference. Whereas Gabe, I know you've been reading a ton, and Paul, now you basically bought out an entire shelf. So I mean, like, do you find this to be consistently kind of like the vibe, worldview, I don't know, subject matter?
Oh, completely. I mean, Gabe hinted at it, you know, when we were doing it for the love of the game, that Simenon just kind of writes this way. It's just like he kind of shows a bleakness to the world that is very personalized within its characters, I would say. Like you were saying that Frank is just like a cut and dry psychopath, which I kind of agree with, but there's also enough characterization in enough moments where I'm like, and his depiction is so well rounded and thought out that I'm like, maybe he was just a sociopath with some like desires to be a psychopath. Like there's a lot of psychoanalysis that you can do if you're into that in all of the books I've read, where you're trying to like figure out someone's personality, which is really fun to me. And but yeah, I would say that Simenon is really good at showing that bleakness and also bringing out what is like wrong to him about culture in all of the novels that I've read. Like the last one I read was The Cat, which Gabe, I hope you read, because that was like a very different one than I've read. And I think it's a lot different than a lot of the books he's read. It's basically like about an old married couple that end up not speaking to each other for like 3 years and only writing each other notes. And that talks a lot about like just how people end up being married in French society around his time in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and how like getting out of a marriage is actually like very difficult. And but I don't know, he has a way of bringing up cultural issues that are still very personalized, and they're not ever like outwardly like, this is what I'm talking about. It's kind of just like in the backdrop of his stories, which I really like about him. It's like, I'm telling a story and these issues are in this story, but it may or may not be why I'm writing it. Would you agree with that, Gabe?
Yeah, I think Simenon, you know, in his detective novels and in some of these the roman doux, as they're called, the hard novels, which he sort of started writing after he had already been writing the Maigret detective novels for a while because he wanted to be taken more seriously. He's I think like I think this is really, really distinct from the sort of existential fiction, the Camus and Sartres of the world, in that like so Frank Friedmeier in this book, I think, is much, much more contemptible and disgusting of a person than, say, the protagonist of The Stranger is, but is also much, much more relatable in some ways for that reason. Like I haven't read The Stranger in a long time, but it always struck me reading those books that like no one is like this. No, this is not, the internal psychology of these people is ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. And okay, I get it, but it doesn't resonate with me. Frank,
Are you talking about with The Stranger?
with The Stranger.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that Simenon does is in describing, especially some of his sort of, I don't want to call them villains because I don't think that's what he's engaged in, but like some of his characters that do hideous things, he has a unique talent for making you relate to those people way more than you feel comfortable doing. And I think that that's true here.
The book feels like a 1-2 punch where like you basically like I haven't had this experience in a while, but like I found myself dreading in the first half, right? Basically, like the things that I knew that were set up that were going to happen, very specifically Sissy and all that. I was just like, fuck, like I know what's happening. He's going to have some old fucking pedophile, you know, he's going to string this girl along and all this kind of shit. And, you know, Frank's doing it for these inchoate to him, but like, you know, increasingly like scaled up reasons of trying to just like, I don't know, find some limit to himself. Like but he's, the whole book is like, here's why this person's a fucking psychopath. Here's why they're contemptible. Here are a number of monstrous things they can do. And here's all these descriptions of him, you know, just being malignant and hating everyone in his life. Bam, jailed, interrogation. And then it's like, yeah, it's very like uncomfortably humanizing.
Yeah, it's such a jarring. I mean, I think like if Camus and Sartre's novels are existential, like I don't think it's fair to call Simenon nihilistic, but it's closer to that end of the spectrum, and I would argue better for it. It's more relatable and more realistic than say The Stranger or Nausea or something like that for me. And I think you're right, Matt, that like the shift halfway through where he's imprisoned. I mean, I have a lot to say about the second half of the book, but it's the narratively what it does is so interesting in terms of the way we think about Frank, because like the shit that Frank is involved in is disgusting. He just kills this German officer for no reason, which obviously like we could talk about the morality of killing German officers in World War II. I'll go on the record as being for it. But like the description of it and Frank's, quote unquote reasoning about it is completely absurd and bad, and like not, he says later on in the book, I'm not a patriot, I'm not a resistance fighter, I'm none of that. He doesn't care. It's just for these own sort of his own obscure reasons. And as Matt was sort of hinting at, he ultimately sort of romances this young girl who lives across the hallway from him in his apartment building, ultimately only to essentially pimp her out to Cromer, his seedy criminal friend, without her knowledge, which is just like, it's so disgusting.
It's so disgusting and so odd. And I'm trying to think of like his motivation for doing it. And I can't figure it out. It's some sort of power play.
He's trying to, I feel like he's just like plunging. He's like feeling out the, like, the best description I can think of is he's just like feeling out the contours of how little he can care. And like,
it kind of reminded me of like,
him.
It was like a little kid, like lighting like a dead rat on fire or something like that. It seemed like in the same realm of just like, I'm just doing this thing and I don't care about the morals of it. I just like want to play in my demented way.
And he for him in his mind, there's all these connections that he draws between, consciously or unconsciously, between sex and death. Like he talks about killing the officer at the beginning as a sort of losing of his virginity, and there are all of these sort of like weird semi-sexual moments where like great violence is happening, and he sort of watches the men that come into his mother's brothel, who I think it's important to note, just plot wise are many of them are high ranking German officers. Her whorehouse specifically caters to Nazi officials. And so there's this sort of connection between sex and death for Frank throughout. The only two things worth writing about: get that coffee.
No. But you're right. I and
Get
like
that French roast.
dark French roast, noir.
Dark.
Get that Ethiopian single origin.
But I actually, like a lot of, random other things I've consumed, media I've consumed, kind of like flashed in my head during different moments of this. But another, may I direct you to episode 1, Shella, Andrew Vax.
Yeah. The Phantom Menace?
Exactly. And it's just that, you've one of the more classically noir notions I think you get in this is that conflation of sex and death and a kind of transactional world of complete coldness. Like, I think that was very like prevalent in Shella and some other noir stuff I've read, is just the world simplified in a terrible way to monetary transactions and a lack of any difference between fucking and killing and this kind of thing. Like, I don't know, that those themes just felt very in your face, because Frank was raised literally with a mother who was a prostitute, I believe, and then eventually like opened her own whorehouse, and like he's just raised on that.
And I think, it's interesting to say like Frank is like, in terms of the sort of class structure of his, and I thought Simenon did such an amazing job in this book of describing the sort of like social intricacies of the apartment building that Frank is living in at the time and the little town that they're in, and the sort of like the habits and the routines of the neighbors and the jobs everyone has and who's talking to who about what. And it really captured, I think, that sort of like oppressive kind of gossipy, but like with life and death implications feel of like Nazi occupation, where you don't know who's watching and you don't know who's talking to who and what they're talking about. You really felt that tightness in this. And so Frank and his family are sort of like hated, not only because of what they're doing, like in terms of having a whorehouse and it being immoral and gross and serving German officers, but also because they have money and no one else in the apartment complex does. And they have all of this, like coal is like one of the main currencies that they talk about. And they have like all of these stores of coal to keep their apartment warm. And I felt like just his description of like the politics of who has coal and who doesn't in the apartment building was just fantastic.
I also really like the overabundance of food. Like, she made a point to like have all of her workers eat tons of food, to the point where like everyone was overweight and there was always food on the table. and Simenon describes like the smells going up to the apartments, and they can like, she just wants to make sure they all smell it, but they can't eat it. It's terrible. But one thing I wanted to go back to in terms of Shella is that I think that this book does a much better job of humanizing I would say almost all of the characters in a way that Shella really didn't. Like, I think you read Shella and you're like, wow, this is a different world that I'm stepping into, and it feels like overtly noir, overtly kind of like Sim City, or Sin City, not Sim
nice,
City.
Dude, yeah.
Sim City's a little different. But this one, and that's one reason I like Simenon so much, though, is that like he gives you these characters and you relate to them with their inner monologues. Especially like with Frank, he is such a freaking psychopath. He's terrible, but those little snippets of inner monologue or little thoughts that Simenon puts in there, like one-off lines, it like, you can think, wow, I've like had a similar thought to that, and I can relate to that really well. And it makes you feel uncomfortable because you're like, this character's so fucking terrible, and he's having this moment, and it's like, wow, I don't know when I've thought that, but I feel like I have. And I don't know, I really like that about
You
his
don't
writing.
even have to have thought it necessarily. It's just more like, even if you've heard it for the first time and you feel the resonance of that sort of agreeing with some part of you, it's disturbing. Like
Yeah,
it could be the first time you've heard it or seen such a thought voiced, but it's like the disturbing aspect is like it's relatable still somehow, and that's fucked up. And I agree with you that like with noir, because like I think Vox operates, maybe, I don't know, I'm not super familiar, but like in more of a genre perspective, like with the genre stuff, you're invited to like, step into a parallel reality. It feels sometimes you're like, okay, here are the rules of noir. Like, here's a more like prescriptive kind of genre, narrative, and the rules, and you're leaving reality. Whereas this, it just like it cleaves too close to like random truths, and like it's very intentionally, I think, creating a disgusting, horrific human being, and it's what they would call the anti-hero now, right? The sort of prestige TV like anti-hero
yeah,
type of character.
Yeah, I think like in terms of the genre question and the sort of like the question of reality and like what sorts of rules does the world have here? I think you're right, Matt, that in noir there's sort of like, certain parameters that the genre sets for itself, for characterization, for storytelling. And I think in this book, you don't get that, not only because of the way that Simenon writes Frank and the events of the story, but because, and maybe this is opening it up a little too fast or too wide, too early, but to me, this is really a war novel. This novel is really about World War II more than it is about any individual person. And I think that, specifically the sort of like overlap between that you get halfway through, which is jarring, right? When Frank is arrested and put in this Nazi sort of interrogation prison. But really what that is a continuation of the sort of like blind, like meaningless indifference that Frank's been exhibiting the entire story, carries over like just directly into the way that he's treated by the occupying forces in the prison. And I think that is very intentional and very like, that was very striking to me. I don't know how you guys felt about the second half, and the whole sort of war angle.
well, I didn't really think about it until you sent that text, or you sent out a tweet that was like, what was it, like the best World War II, not, I forget what it was, but you were basically
Yeah, I
saying,
think it's one of the best not like novels about World War II that I've ever read.
yeah, and I really didn't. I think I have a tendency to just focus on what's happening with the characters, and I of course understood the context, but I have more of a tendency to just focus more on like what's happening interpersonally. Um, but after you said that, I was thinking about it more, and I was like, yeah, this all of these, the whole plot really wouldn't have happened without the war.
Yes, that, and you guys are kind of bringing up the thing that was giving me a glimmer of hope and something that felt pretty much hermetically sealed, pure fucking evil. Uh, like I feel like I was just hot boxing despair. But like I think that's the out, is like
Dutch
the
oven
fact
of despair.
yeah, just smell it, fucker. But like that, it's only because like how to I had a nice elegant way to put it.
They're
The
in a
context, they're in a machine already. Like they're in a context where these kind of things are always going to flourish, and you see somebody who is the like purified, fucking alien, perfect perfect organism kind of this world, inside of a larger circle that is like the world that created him. And like all of this only makes sense and feels inevitable in that world, and that world doesn't necessarily have to exist. And I feel like that's like So like the glimmers of hope are always on like the kind of like outskirts and fringes of this novel. I think in moments like when Frank sees that woman in the window and stuff.
Yeah, I mean there are various moments throughout the text, including, I mean, I think most dramatically at the end, which we don't have to talk about necessarily right now, but when Holst and Sissy visit him in prison, and Frank hears about Holst's son, and sort of there are all these other sort of glimpses of like what life could have been for Frank under different circumstances, who he could have turned out to be, like what sort of alternative paths he might have taken. And none of them are ever really, the book's written in such a way that we're not necessarily looking at things from Frank's perspective all the time, but it's sort of like it's kind of like an over the shoulder camera. So we get a little bit of what Frank's thinking, but I think you never really get the sense that any of those possibilities are like super real to him. And maybe a little bit in those sort of fever dreams about the woman in the window, Matt, that you mentioned,
right?
Which is just when Frank is in prison and starts to sort of lose track of time, he sort of starts trying to keep his sanity by following this woman's routine that he can see out of his prison window. And she goes out and airs her laundry and stuff like that. And he sort of imagines, what her husband does and what his life would be like if, they had been together or whatever. But I think you're totally right in pointing out that Frank is a creature of this context, both, Frank was born in this context, and he's basically Bane. He's born in it, molded by it.
I was born in the dog.
We finally did it.
Yeah, we did it. We tried last episode for somehow, didn't we?
We did, and we failed, and now we've succeeded.
But it's
come organically.
It's because it's appropriate now.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the dark. Yeah, it says I was born in the dark. I mean, this is the dark.
I was born in the dark. You were merely a visitor. But yeah, I think that Simenon does that in all the novels that I've read by him. He actually he has a framework of life around his characters, and the framework seems to always affect the characters within it in a really profound way. And it's like they get stuck in like a box, and their worldview is shrinked maybe, and it's always like a good exercise for me to be like, yeah, what if Frank didn't have this framework? What if he grew up with a father? What if his mom didn't make these choices? Would his personality be the way that it is? And I think for like the psychological aspect of my interests, that interests me a lot. Is like, it's like the nature versus nurture type whatever. Like, would this person have been this way without the circumstantial framework that they're in?
And I think it's important to point out in that connection that his mom is as bad, if not worse, of a person than Frank is. I mean, she's a monster in and of herself. She's sort of like, she reminded me of what's her name? The like really nice professor from Harry Potter who's really secretly evil and has like the pink office and is just like the worst. You know who I'm talking about. Morgan, who is it? Umbridge. Dolores Umbridge. Yeah.
Dolores Umbridge. Perfect. That's a great name.
Yeah. And because Frank's mom goes out of her way to like put perfume on and look really nice and primped and everything, when really she's pimping out underage girls to Nazi officers and like essentially grooming them and then kicking them out of her house when they get too old.
Yes.
Well, she reminded me of Granny from Spirited Away. You know what I'm talking about?
Granny.
Does she pimp girls out?
Yeah, I don't
know. But she basically like enslaves people to work at her like bathhouse, and the way she treats her giant fat baby son is really similar to the way that she treats Frank. She treats Frank like a baby.
All right, you're selling me. You're selling me.
Yeah.
I'm buying it, dude. I think that's right.
And every time she like spoke to Frank, I was like a little bit disgusted in a weird way. Like, you're being nice to him and you're like his mother and you love him, but you're like gross and terrible too. And you should, I don't know. It was gross. Those interactions were gross.
If you were sort of, all you can, because the book is, I think, so vague and washed out and giving you any kind of route out of just constantly questioning what could have been, or like alternate realities or counterfactuals or whatever, like you can still kind of armchair psychologize with the mom and be like, she was the first person for whom it seems like he could kind of gain a worldview as that kind of thing, and then like despise it, but it poisons him. And so, his initial, like, maybe somewhat moral instinctive reaction that this is bad, or that people are bad, or these people are bad, his mom's bad, seems maybe it could have toxified him, and now he's just trying to go for this kind of game of chicken with death. Ultimately is what it resulted in, where he's just like, and the world shit. He reminded me of like if Holden Caulfield was just more fucked up.
Yeah.
Because there's a big element of like people are phony also in his, because he's a teenager still. Like,
yeah, I had a little bit of like, I hate to even put it in this category, but because he was so young, I can't discount it as not a coming of age story, but there has to be a different word for that. Just like the mind of a younger teen boy being explored. It's definitely not coming of age.
You
But
said this before,
I
didn't
know.
you, Paul? Bildungsroman. Didn't you say that for a previous
What
book?
did I say?
Bildungsroman.
I talked about that with the lion, the mountain lion, right? That I thought, or no, Gabe called it a coming of age story. I can't remember, but yeah, I did that.
I don't think this is really, I mean, I get what you're saying, but like, I also don't think this is that at all, because like one of the main features of that sort of story for me is that there's like a lesson or something. and there's really not, like, Frank never has a
future.
Yeah. Frank never has that.
He doesn't want one.
Exactly. And we can talk about sort of what he takes from that last interaction with Holst and Sissy.
Yeah, I do. That's the only thing that I feel like there was some growth, but we should talk about that maybe later.
I think by that point he's just basically lost his mind. That was my sort of read on it. I mean, I think so basically, I mean, Frank definitely has some issues, some like parent issues beyond his mom, which is part of this weird relationship he has with. So basically, right, he pimps out Sissy after like romancing her, and she's like what, 14, 15, something like that she's
15.
supposed to be. And he takes her to the movies, and she sort of
fingers her, and then fingers like her, she's all good to his pedophile friend.
Well, yeah, because he determines that she's a virgin, and then because that's what his friend cares about, and he ultimately winds up sort of basically pimping her out to this guy, and she runs out into the snow, and he tries to find her, and he can't, and he is arrested before he can figure out what happened to her, and so he doesn't know if she's alive or dead. And I mean, she does come back, but she's very sick, with pneumonia or something, presumably.
Right.
Yeah.
And her father, Frank, has this weird feeling about relationship with her father, where he's constantly sort of trying to go out of his way to pass him in the hallway to see if he's going to hit him or attack him or say something to him or anything, and he just never does. And one of the sort of, I wouldn't call it a subplot, but it comes up a couple times, is that Frank doesn't know who his father is, and it might be it might be this police inspector that his mom knows who comes to the apartment. It might be someone else. And so I think he kind of has this strange relationship with his neighbor Holst. Holst. Yeah. And I think that's just worth noting. He's got daddy.
Yeah,
but it's
he's got some daddy
definitely
issues for sure.
But I mean, you think it's one of like the final, like, maybe little life preservers you're gonna get thrown at the end that is denied you. It's like the last one. It's like maybe it's the maybe it's just the paternity that's fucked him up. It's like it's like the final and easiest kind of explanation for why a person is messed up, right? Is like fucking degenerate single mom kind of, but that's not given to you either. You don't know.
Yeah.
And it's not Holst, it turns out. It's just a person he's latched an arbitrary meaning to because of circumstance in a search for, it seems like someone to beat his ass and punish him a little bit as well. Like he wants it. He's like,
Well, that comes out too in like the one woman who's working at, or the one girl who's working at the brothel that he ends up like not really having feelings for, but is interested in longer than the other girls is it Annie?
Annie.
Who's like, he describes her as being like very beautiful, but she has like this kind of disdain view, outward disdain view of the men she has to have sex with. And he kind of like is attracted to her ability to like brush him off. So I think there is something to be said about him like kind of desiring punishment, not only from a father figure, but also from like a female figure, maybe a love interest if he were to get that far someday, but he didn't.
I saw Annie as more of a peer that he was recognizing, someone who is more attuned to the way in which to manipulate people while feeling nothing. And he was like, oh, that was my take from that, was like he was just more intrigued by like what he thought was like a fellow traveler.
Well, I do think those things go hand in hand, right? The ability to take punishment of various types while not feeling anything. So, you know, and I think you're right, Matt, that's something that he sort of admires in Annie. But also I think that is sort of, it's also this sort of challenge, right? Like, what is it going to take for me to fucking feel something, right? So, I mean, there's when he's pondering the possibility of being tortured by the Nazis, it's mentioned that he sort of used to like just stick himself with tacks as a kid, right. just to like, you know, see.
I hurt myself today. See if I still feel. Yeah.
It's me when I drink coffee without heartburn medicine in the morning.
You're just being Trent, you're being Trent Reznor. I take my coffee black like my fucking soul, dude.
Yeah.
Ow. Yeah.
Frank Reznor.
So Johnny Reznor. Trent Cash. Okay. But yeah, I think that this whole question of like Frank's, because I don't even think it's a search for meaning, which I think it would make it sort of something closer to a coming of age story or something like that. It's just like nothing. He's just grasping for nothing. He doesn't know what it is. He doesn't know what he's trying to do. He has no motivations. He's just like literally flailing. It seems to me.
But to me, that is kind of how I felt as a teenager. I felt like just like looking back, I feel like I was just a puddle of impulses that I wasn't searching for meaning in my like outward cortex or whatever, but that is what I was doing when I was stumbling through the fucking darkness of being 15 to 19, you know? So, but I agree though. It like thematically, I don't think it could be classified as a coming of age story. There's no lesson. There's no real growth.
Well,
but
keep going. Sorry.
No, I was going to say that there is something about a story told from a teenager's or young 20-something person's perspective that has similar themes to me that can resonate in a way that a coming of age story does.
Well, so this is what I was saying, like, you know, when you're 7, and then I think multipliers of that when you're about 14, 15, like, and then in your 20s, I think the common thread maybe is just this like feeling out of the world and its rules and your place in it. And like, literally, you don't know what they are. So you're just kind of trying to garner reactions from the environment that you're in, and then depending on what comes back at you, that's what you take in and you adjust your behavior accordingly. But like for Frank, that world that he's in, again, to reiterate, is like so it's just so like violent and arbitrarily ordered, and hypocrisy and all this kind of stuff are what are seem to be rewarded, and there are just these machinations and rules that are like so Kafkaesque and bureaucratic that like you're trying to feel out the machinery around you, and it just keeps evading your grasp. And I think that's the kind of stuff that is like plaguing Frank. And I think it's interesting that it's like it yields in him, I don't know, yeah, like looking to what he finds as the reaction of his world doesn't discourage him from continuing to like become more and more of a violent, shitty person, because that's the world.
Yeah, and I think you said it right, Matt. Like one of the other features of those sort of classic comedy, and you're right, Paul. Even if they're sort of not searching for meaning, in a conscious or deliberate way, they often stumble upon it in spite of themselves, right? In those stories, and that does not happen here. Like the world that Frank lives in is like actively hostile to any type of meaning making or sense making, in its absurdity and contradictions, and like just the faceless nonsense of Nazi bureaucracy, which I feel like this book captured in a way that like even books that are directly addressed to that don't do as well.
Yeah.
It precisely because of the sort of like Frank's struggle in prison, trying to like find a way to keep track of shit and be like, okay, here's the pattern that they're engaged in. Like, here's when they're going to interview me about what topics, and here's what they want to know. Here's the, he has like this sort of like Arya Stark-esque list of names that he keeps repeating to himself. And he feels like he's getting a handle on it, and it's just completely wrong, and it has nothing to do with what's actually happening. And I felt that sense of just despair like so acutely when I was reading that section. Like, so like basically what happens just plot wise is, Frank's arrested, and at first he sort of thinks, okay, someone turned me in for, he had a gun he wasn't supposed to have, and he had killed a Nazi officer and someone else that he knew from childhood, which is a really fucking depressing scene that maybe we can talk about. It was a watchmaker's wife that he knew, and he went and killed her to take the watches to sell to another Nazi officer. And so he's done all this terrible stuff, and he's arrested, and he's trying to be like, okay, who turned me in? What did they turn me in for? I'm here. Whose murder am I here for? Or is it the gun or whatever? And it turns out that it's none of that, he's there because essentially he passed off a banknote that the Nazis were able to trace back to a particular facility, and it meant that someone within their ranks had stolen the money. And so they didn't give a shit about Frank at all. They didn't care who he had killed or what he had done. All they wanted to know was where he had gotten the money so they could figure out who within their own ranks was corrupt. He was like the least important, and so he's in his head thinking like, I've done all these terrible things, and I'm getting in some perverse way that he's getting recognized for these terrible things that he had done. When really he was just a non-factor in the entire affair the whole time.
Right.
Yeah.
The fucking key is always recognition. Like that's what he's sort of seeking. And another refrain is the phrase "who cares?" Like it kind of it might be one of the most repeating things I think was like in the book was just the phrase "who cares?" Like there'd be this long list of realizations and fucking epiphanies and whatnot, and how things are interrelated that he hadn't seen before, and then it would just end with who gives a shit though. Like, who cares?
There was also a section where I think it was after he murdered the watchmaker's wife, or was it a watchmaker? I don't remember. But he keeps being he keeps thinking that everyone secretly knows like what he has done. And he's like kind of walking around, and he's like, he knows. Oh yeah, they know. Oh, she knows for sure. And it's all completely in his head, but in those moments reading it, you're like, do they know? They probably know something's wrong. Something's like, some screw has been loosened for sure. But it was still totally in his head. No one knew.
Yeah, there's just this, especially the second half when he gets arrested, like there's just this overwhelming and just like exhausting. Like I found myself like realizing I hadn't taken a breath in like a couple minutes reading the second half of this book, just being exhausted by the sense of like trying to make sense out of something that just is never going to fucking make any sense because it's ridiculous, which is Nazi bureaucracy and the sort of entire sort of like functioning of German occupation during this time. It was just absurd, and there was not like,
which can be writ large, you know, I think further to not just include Nazi bureaucracy, but just, you know, senseless proliferation of organization through unknown sort of mutation and shit. It's like, but what's perverse too is that like Frank seems to be garnering meaning for a time from the act of trying to interpret all of these moments when he's in prison that are like almost erotically and like excitingly supercharged with meaning because of the fact that he has to like account for himself, and he's just trying to now play this game, which again is, you know, kind of analogous to life of buying yourself more time. Like,
yeah, I would say like the novel is existentialist insofar as it says that what Frank is engaged in by the end is just simply deciding to make his own meaning out of nothing on a day-to-day basis, which is the existentialist thesis essentially, which is that you just have to just fucking decide to make meaning out of shit that doesn't inherently have any. And right. You know, he just arbitrarily essentially decides, I'm just going to not tell them anything. I could tell them everything and they might even let me go because they will quickly find out that I don't fucking know anything. I could give them Cromer's name. I could tell them I sold the watches to a general and that's where I got this money. But he just essentially decides for no fucking reason, I'm just not going to say anything. And that's where he starts to derive his like meaning on a day-to-day basis, is just that sort of sheer will of resistance for no reason.
Right. A sort of pointless defiance of reality. I don't know how I would describe that really, but
I would say it was just like his behavior just kind of coincided with how he was behaving in his role up to that point. Like, people don't talk to the police or the occupying force. I feel like he had a little bit of like I don't know, like street mindedness in him. Like, you don't talk, and
well,
you have clout if you don't talk. So I'm gonna find meaning from that.
He has those like fucking punk kid rules about him too, of just like shitty kids, where he's like, again, it's like kind of just more like pressing against the walls of authority and figuring out if there's any sort of like weak point. I mean, that's what it feels like initially. And I mean, the one thing I kind of do agree with Volman's afterward about is just sort of like, in a way, he did a super slow-mo death by cop, potentially, by killing the officer, which was arguably something that was like something that was the most intentional, in the sense that like it was to see if it would result in what he assumed was the inevitability of arrest and murder in the, you know, sort of traitor prison thing.
Yeah, he basically comes to grips with the fact that he's gonna die. Spoiler alert, he is the end of the story is he's just tortured and shot. And
it's not a fun book, dude. We made this clear early.
And he comes to grips with that pretty early on. Like, essentially, as soon as he finds out about the like secretly marked money, he knows that they'll never release him because they can't let that knowledge just get into general circulation.
Right.
And so he sort of comes to grips with the fact that he's going to die pretty early on. which I think is sort of another sort of interesting like existential microcosm, which is like, yeah, we all are sort of coming to grips with the fact that we're going to die on whatever timetable, and we have to sort of still find things to latch onto in the meantime, whether that's just resisting these like for no reason forces that Frank is resisting, or counting the number of times that a woman opens her window and does her laundry or whatever.
I found one of the things I found interesting was again, there's like an argument to be made for some sort of growth in Frank, right? In his conception of the reality he's in. But I don't know how you guys felt about this. But like another thing that was kind of like pinging back and forth was what Frank thought about, because another idea that comes up, and I just watched a movie with Jim Belushi and Michael Caine called Mr. Destiny. It's a 1990 comedy. It's rated PG-13. It's very nice and wholesome, but I was thinking,
is it a 5-bagger?
It's probably a 4-bagger. It fucking rules.
Popcorn classic.
Is it a popcorn classic?
Underappreciated popcorn classic, I would say, and I mean that genuinely. But the concept of destiny comes up a couple times as well, and I don't know. Again, it's hard when you're talking about existentialism, right? Which is such like a fucking like well-trod and cliche riddled and almost cringe field.
Get that coffee.
Thought. You know what I mean, right, Gabe? You among all of us must know that it's like rough to even say the word existentialist without people rolling their eyes.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think for me, not even as a flex, but as just someone who just has an academic background in philosophy, existentialism is the thing that if you hear someone talk about, they have never actually read any philosophy, and it's just the most cringe thing ever.
How do we avoid this, Gabriel?
You guys are fine. You've actually read philosophy.
Whoa. Thank you.
Whoa.
Get that coffee.
Thank you. Thank you.
So like, I don't know. I just was like searching through my stuff that I highlighted, which is pretty random, but like, so just some random thing like, Frank, I'm begging you, listen to me. No. Too bad for her and the girls. He was going to stay. He wouldn't run away. This is page 94. He wouldn't run away in the night the way they were trying to make him do, because like they know he's in trouble. He wouldn't hole up with Cromer or a friend of his mother's. And then his mom just says, "You do as you please." And he just says, "Yes." And I was just thinking of the fucking "Yes, Chad" meme. You know, just like the fucking. And I'm like, yeah. Similar vibes in all the darkness that implies as well. Like,
yes.
And the notion of like the tension between, is he making a choice in any way, or like, has he surrendered, or is he asserting himself? And I think that question is another one that's just kind of unresolved, but is just sort of ambiently floating around the book.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it also, bringing up the whole thing about destiny, which Frank talks about, like you said, a few times in the second half, especially. And I think this question of like, is he giving up, or is he just sort of resigning himself to, like, certainly he resigns himself to his own death eventually, but it becomes this sort of like, Nietzschean, like amor fati like thing where, and of course Nietzsche was a sort of like proto existentialist, blah, 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 whatever. But, his thing was sort of, you have to, part of the point of life is to sort of come to love your own fate, which, the existentialists would reject, because fate is like this predetermined thing that they don't believe in. But anyway, that I think these sort of questions about destiny raise that kind of specter as well. And again, like you said, it's not really resolved. It's just kind of like,
right.
Yeah. Well, it was a similar ending to The Widow, I would say, right? Kind of like death by being caught. Like I'm accepting my fate. You guys remember the ending?
Yeah.
So so out of the 4 books I've read by Simenon, 2 of them have had very similar endings, just kind of like being resigned to your fate, being resigned to the choices you made and the person you've become, and kind of wanting to like resign yourself to being caught as a way of like being free.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
right.
mean um one of the things that I love about Simenon's detective novels is that we've talked about this before, and is that they basically are just like, yep, it was the guy you thought it was the whole time, and there's not like it's not ever like an Agatha Christie fucking Rube Goldberg mousetrap like
No.
explanation of what happened. It's the guy you thought it was for the reasons you thought it was, and there's no like big reveal, and it's just kind of like, here's things that happened in the order that they happened, and it was the guy you thought it was from the beginning.
Yeah, it's like sorry, it's like watching an episode of the first 48 just in book form.
Yeah.
It's like this is just detectives finding the guy that you probably think did it, or you don't know who did it yet, but you have an idea of who it was because it's displaying this like truthful world of shit.
And I think
it's,
that that's kind of just there's a similar line playing out here, which is that Frank sucks and he's gonna die, and he sucks and dies, and that's like the story. I mean, I want to read this paragraph from near the end. This is Frank's sort of final speech to his interrogator in the prison after he's visited by Sissy and Holst for the last time. He says, I stole the watches and I killed Mademoiselle Vilmos. That's the watchmaker's wife. Oh, the sister, I guess. The sister of the watchmaker in my village. I had already killed one of your officers at the corner of the blind alley that leads to the tannery in order to take his automatic because I wanted one. I did things that were much more shameful. I committed the worst crime in the world, but that has nothing to do with you. I am not a fanatic, an agitator, or a patriot. I am a piece of shit. Since you began interrogating me, I've done everything I could to gain time because I simply had to have more time. Now it's over. And I just feel like that's basically the book.
That's it. I did have that highlighted as well.
Yeah.
And that
Okay,
and
the
that's
one thing that,
oh,
sorry.
You go first.
I was going to say the this is maybe off topic, but the one line in that segment, he says, I've done things that are way more shameful. And I was thinking, what does he think is more shameful than murdering 2 people? And I thought it was what he did to Sissy. And I think to me that shows an ounce of humanity. It doesn't necessarily add up to a lesson, but it adds up to some minute aspect of humanity or growth in the way that Frank can, which is just an ounce. But it uh but is that what you guys thought of, like what he was referring to as like the more shameful
Yeah,
act?
definitely.
100%. Like there are like probably 4 instances you could point to where Frank demonstrates some potential long since doomed flicker of like innocence or purity of heart or some kind of thing. You know, he's fucked at that point and he's a shit just monster, but like you do get a very small little crumbs of just like maybe an alternate path could have been there for him.
And I think he does get a little bit of validation from Holst towards the end, when Holst kind of tells him that story about his own son who stole some medical supplies and was when caught just jumped out a window and killed himself. And Frank is like, I thought it was a hilarious line. It was like, Frank was like, I was gonna say I wish I was your son, but that might come out wrong. Something like that. And he just I think Holst's line to Frank, where he's just like, you see, it's not an easy job being a man. And then Frank just kills himself after that, basically just resigns himself to dying. I think that's the sort of last bit of like semi-redemption, is that Holst has this sort of sense of like, you're fucked up, but it's not entirely on you.
Yeah.
The like the thing about the sort of like direct, just like it was who you thought it was. This is the murderer. They did it for the shitty, brutally dumb, straightforward reasons you expected. Like, it's funny, but also, right, like that, it isn't that what's supposed to keep inviting the larger question. And like, even further, you mentioned, what was the show, Paul?
The First 48.
I just think of like any murder mystery, fucking My Favorite Murder, like Last Podcast on the Left or whatever, and just the general like notion of like how obsessed people are with like serial killer shit and this kind of this is, I feel like this is like the closest you get in popular culture now to a similar type of skirting of this idea, right? Of like what everyone seems to be obsessed with is establishing a coherent rationale for like the act that occurred. And I do find it
Yeah.
interesting that it's still like, while we're here reading Dirty Snow and it's like, fuck, dude, this is so heavy. Like, I don't know who I would ever get to like also read this book and like enjoy it. At the same time, there's like 8 billion people who listen to My Favorite Murderer. And I'm like, I don't know if it's
Well,
completely out of line with the same themes in some ways.
well, it isn't. And I want to say this. Uh this is why fiction is fucking good, because like
Yeah, dude, read.
like this is why this book is awesome, because it's a made up story, whatever, but it's more relatable to get into the mindset of someone who is murderous in this book than it is to listen to anything about serial murderers who are like beyond monstrous. They're beyond Frank. Frank, you can understand his frame point or his framework and kind of put yourself in the mindset of him, and you can come out with like an experience with this character. But when you're just reading about like true crime and serial murderers, those people are like unrelatable.
I think that one of the reasons that I like this book so much is sort of what you guys are saying, and specifically why I think it's a really good book about World War II specifically, is that it bridges this gap between, see, I always have a hard time with this, right? Like where we're talking about, a serial killer or a school shooter or whatever, right? There's always this initial reaction of, specifically in the media and stuff, and um of sort of like, this is just evil incarnate. There's nothing to say about it. There's no point in analyzing it. It's just pure evil and it's a mystery, right? But of course, if you dig deeper into any serial killer or school shooter or any like seemingly, like black box of violent evil, there's always a context. There's always a history. There's always a story that can be told about how you get from point A to point B, as to why that person is the way they are, to some greater or lesser degree of explanatory power. And I think placing Frank in the context of a historical moment that is probably the best example that we have in human history of just like a black box of evil, which is the Holocaust and World War II, but also using that context as itself an explanation of why Frank is the way he is. Because like we've been saying, he is molded by this context. He's created by this context. So it's not that he's just this like unrelatable, like faceless, uninterpretable monster. There's a context, and that's always the case, even with stuff that seems apparently to be meaningless evil.
See, what you just said is what I was trying to say, but you did it a lot better. but but you're totally right.
Also not, but also not, the tension is still like, not to say, oh, this person's a product of their times, or this person is evil. It's not to do the binary, it's not to excuse away something as horrific as the stuff Frank did, while also not being like there's no explanation. It's neither of those cases.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
think that another thing that this book does really well, and I think better than a lot of other books written about this topic, is talk about, I think one of the things that a lot of people are dissatisfied with when they talk about like, why did this person do this evil thing, or why did this awful thing happen, is that the answer is often really boring and like not particularly illuminating, right? This is the sort of classic Arendtian point about the banality of evil, which she specifically coined in relation to the Holocaust and the crimes that were committed by high-ranking German officials. And I feel like this book captures that so well. Like it's not that there aren't explanations. It's not that these people are literal hell demons just doing things for the sake of their own pleasure or whatever, but it's that the explanations might not be as satisfying as you want them to be. And that's the case for a lot of individual evil acts that people do, and it's the case for sometimes large-scale social evils.
And I didn't pick the book. I just want that to be clear as well. This was Paul's pick, and I know it's been a joke that I pick Holocaust stuff, and this is Paul's pick.
Yeah, but to be
so
fair,
I think if you want to read a book about the banality of evil, read this book. Skip Arendt.
Well, and also to be fair, this book doesn't actually say the word Nazi in one time.
True, very true. Yo, I gotta piss.
Pee break.
Pee break.
Pee accomplished.
Wow, feels good.
We did it, guys. We did our bodily functions.
There was only other. I feel like maybe we're winding down, and I wanted to just randomly select some stuff that I had highlighted just for the shits of it.
Yep.
I do have one more point I would want to talk about too, but we can do it.
Nah, do it, Paul.
Before we start reading segments.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, I was thinking that Simenon, with this book and this character of Frank in particular, kind of tried to display probably one of the most revolting characters. I mean, I've only read 4 of his novels, but I would say that this character of Frank is probably the most psychopathic, the most revolting out of the characters I've read of his. And I think he was possibly trying to display as much of Frank in a terrible light, and then by the end make you feel sorry for him, and just to see if he could do it.
Right.
And I think with Matt, with your text being so distraught about like this is a mean book.
Yeah.
And I don't think you would have written that if you didn't have some feeling about his death happening the way it did, and just him dying in general. So for me, I think it was successful, if that was one aspect of what he was trying to do with this book. Like, build someone up in a terrible light and then tear them down, but kind of the opposite. Like, by the end of it, he looks like shit. He's missing his 2 front teeth. He's going insane. He's crying in his jail cell. And then he gets shot.
Well, one of the phrases I latched onto was something along the lines of it was during the imprisonment scene, which is that half of the book is so chock full of like phrases and just like turns of phrase and stuff that are like so pithy, and I highlighted a lot around there, but just something along the lines of like it was a formality it would have been pointless to refuse. That's just that. Yeah, that's a deeply sad notion.
And and I think again, like as a statement about like he sort of referring to his own death there. Like it's this, and again, it's that was the sort of the hideousness of the Nazi bureaucracy and the sort of banality of death. It was, he talks about people just sort of calculating numbers and figures, and that was the scariest thing,
Right. It's something that like, we touched on in Soul of Wood, but like, yeah, this really made you stare directly at it in a way more like stark way. I would say.
One of the things, I totally agree. One of the things that I highlighted, just because it's on a similar kind of like tip to what you were just talking about, Matt, it's on 233 in our edition. So he's talking about his interrogator, who he refers to as the old gentleman, who is just like this like very, very scary figure to me in the book. He's just like this like obdurate force of nature who's always at the desk, always never goes to the bathroom, never even takes a drink of water. He just sits there and smokes and interrogates Frank over and over again.
I pictured him looking like the farmer from Babe.
Wow, way to ruin a cherished childhood classic.
How dare you? I thought he looked like current day Rick Moranis.
Oh man, I don't even know what that looks like.
Yeah, I thought he was described as very tall though, so I thought Babe Dad.
I guess I could kind of see Babe Dad. Anyway,
Babe Dad. That's my next Instagram account, Babe Dad.
So he says, the old gentleman consulted one of his scraps. They knew Frank would have sworn they had known everything from the beginning. Then why all this pretense? What more did they want to know? What were they hoping for? After all, they were wasting their time more than they were wasting his. And I just feel like that's just, again, with sort of the like pointlessness, the meaninglessness of the whole sort of Nazi operation. It's just this like faceless machine just like chewing up people and time, and none of it means anything in the sort of ultimate cashing out.
Right. And it's just the inertia of its function.
Right. It's banal.
Very banal.
Ghost in the Shell. The thing I highlighted was this. It was lucky he hadn't finished his sentence. He had to get out of the habit of speaking pointless words. He didn't know yet that everything he saw had its importance and became a little more important with each day. You think, quote unquote, school. He was imprisoned in a school that was refurbished as a prison. And you have a ready-made image of it in your mind. But in some cases, the tiniest detail might one day become so precious that you would never forgive yourself for not having looked at it more carefully. And the idea of like ready-mades and not speaking unless you know what you mean to say I was just thinking like there's also like some Wittgenstein kind of meditations in the prison sequence, especially where, again, because of this context in which everything is hypercharged with meaninglessness also becomes the mirrored kind of like doubled in importance as well. And there's all this notion of what things mean what, and communication, and what's worthwhile and what isn't. And that was very interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, by the time he's locked up, the show of lack of meaning is so apparent because of the bureaucracy that he's being withheld in, and just like his own notions too. It's just like a cluster of just nothing. And it was really it was just like very drab to just suddenly realize he's in this position where just like all of his thoughts and questions don't even matter. His conspiracies they don't matter. Like none of them come to fruition. It's just all bullshit.
One of the other,
and his captors don't care either. They just don't care.
Yeah, it's the only thing they care about is who stole their money.
Yeah.
Maybe my favorite passage in the book, or one of them, sort of related to what you were saying, Matt, about like noticing details and things that sort of gain meaning in small ways. It's on 180, and this is him in the prison. His face was buried in his jacket, which he had rolled into a ball to make a pillow. A jacket, he was sorry to say, that had been almost new when he arrived. And he had been stupid at first to be so careful with it, to take it off at night so that now it didn't smell as good as it might. To get a good whiff of himself, to breathe in that smell of earth, of being alive, of sweat. Deliberately, he sank his nose in where it stank most, under the arms. He wanted to stink as people said outside, to stink as the earth stinks. Because outside, people think that men stink, that the earth stinks. To feel his heartbeat everywhere in his temples, his wrists, his big toes, to smell the smell of his breath, the warmth of it. to mix up the images in his mind, larger, bigger than life, things seen, heard, and lived, and others too that might have happened, to mix them all together, his eyes closed, his body still, while he listened for a certain footstep on the iron stairs.
Damn. I mean,
So good.
that's a sort of perverse version of like mindfulness practice.
Self-care in a Nazi prison camp.
I mean, that's kind of true, right? Another, it seemed like another maybe superficial window or superficial exit out of just being damned. Seemed like maybe this kind of like, yeah, like eat, pray, love, fucking, feeling your body and being present in the moment, and that's what prison does to you or something.
Eat, pray, sniff your dirty armpits.
Eat, pray, sniff your pit stains.
Oh.
But that, that's not what you're given at the end of the day.
What did you guys make of him referring to his last meeting with Holst and Sissy as a wedding? I thought that was really gross and disturbing.
It was like,
yeah, for sure.
To me, it was like the crux of his like just kind of going insane from sleep deprivation and living out this like weird fever dream fantasy. We didn't talk a lot about like the aspect of him having a fever was kind of a theme throughout it. Like he could be sick, and I thought maybe that was going to play more of a role, but it was kind of just more like a deranged theme throughout the whole thing. And I think by the end of it, he's kind of in a feverish state. Only he's not really sick. He just has this like, lack of sleep. He's in a freaking camp. He's going insane. He's missing his 2 front teeth. He hasn't changed his underwear. But yeah, I thought it was definitely super tragic and sad and odd, because he didn't even like ever say that he loved Sissy. It was very strange. It was very strange.
The like wedding imagery there felt a little disingenuous, but in a way that was intentional and very like pointedly tragic. Like I don't know, he's like, it's almost like this final gasp of like some sort of trad fucking notion of what his life could be, and the only way he was able to achieve something as conventional as like falling in love and getting married. Because
Well, let me
I was just gonna say, Sissy's the only one who like elicits one of those moments I was describing that are like, there's probably, you can count them on your hands, where Frank is like just not a self-consciously cold monster, where when they're kind of like both lying to Wimmer, the apartment next door old guy, and then they like laugh and stuff. Like you can tell he's like, that family, for some fucking reason that's never made clear, it holds some charge of meaning for him that is from a prior life almost.
I think it's actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I think it's sort of the fact that she's named Sissy is interesting, because Holst is also sort of his dad figure, and he says he wants to be Holst's son, and she would be his literal sister in that scenario.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say this is an exorbitant theory about this scenario, but take away the framework of all of their lives and the circumstances that they're in, and maybe like devalue a little bit Frank's psychopathy. Maybe that relationship could have happened, and he could have had a father figure with his with Holst as his father-in-law, and he was kind of imagining. It's an exorbitant theory, but
well, I mean, he sort of, that's kind of his thinking about it at the end. Like he says on 240, when Sissy and Holst were there, he says they mustn't stay too long. Frank probably wouldn't be able to stand it. That was all he had and all he wanted. It was his lot. He had nothing before and nothing would exist after. This was his wedding, his own wedding. This was his honeymoon, his life. It had to be lived all at once, taken in a single dose, while the old gentleman went on rummaging among his scraps. They wouldn't have a window that opened, laundry to hang out to dry, a cradle. If there had been all that, then perhaps there would have been nothing at all, just Frank raging against destiny. It wasn't whether it lasted that mattered, it just mattered that it was. And I think that's him sort of thinking about like, yeah, like a sort of alternate path, and maybe even that it may have been worse if it had gone that way, frankly.
I mean, they even
Frankly.
hint at that, right? Like, would it? Yeah, that question is literally asked, right? Like, would any of this have been better were he to, you know, that woman from the window that he follows who just does her laundry and has a child who he fantasizes about? Is it yet another just like, you know, from this vantage point, that looks good. Now I can romanticize it because it's unattainable kind of bullshit. Wherein if Frank were that husband to that woman he was fantasizing about, he'd just be a fucking monster piece of shit who is still testing the limits of fate by being worse and worse over time.
Star Wars Obi-Wan from a certain point of view.
I have to read this passage because it's like it should have been the quote on the cover. And always the dirty snow, the heaps of snow that look rotten with black patches and embedded garbage, the white powder that occasionally peels off from the crust of the sky in little clumps like plaster from the ceiling, is unable to cover the fill. Great little passage. It
Says
kind
it
of
all
like
right there.
says it all.
I do like the whole environmental vibe of like fucking the dead of winter. It's cold as shit. There's slush, but there's also like just icy, inhospitable snow, and everything's fucking cold. I think Simenon, and this is what I noticed even with the one other book I read, which is The Widow, is his descriptions of light are figure in pretty prominently, and always seem to just sort of like gobsmack people. Like light is like a very like tactile presence in the two books I read thus far.
Yeah, the environmental description is excellent, particularly in the first half when he's describing the sort of apartment and the bars and all that stuff. The whole book for me felt like it took place on the GoldenEye Nintendo 64 level surface when you're outside in the snow, and it's like this one. It just felt like the whole book felt like it took place on that level for
That's
me.
him with the semi-automatic. You should just post that and just be like Frank in town.
That's actually a good idea. That'll be the meme.
Frank killing the eunuch.
Colorized 2020. Should we any final thoughts before we do what we do this time?
Do we do Harry Potter and then scores? Is that what we do?
Yeah, man.
So do you want to do final thoughts with the score? I forget what we do. If we do final thoughts and
I was
Harry
just
Potter
if you had any
score.
other like big points to make before we do we go into our fan favorite segment.
Yeah. I mean, they're chomping at the bit right now, but
they're drooling over the possibility of Well,
we're Wizard Frank.
Welcome everybody to the fan favorite segment. We literally just read another book where we take the characters from the book we just read and put them in Harry Potter houses by making them wear the Sorting Hat.
That's right. And that's right.
Who do we start with? Frankie boy?
Probably Frank. The man of the hour, Frank Friedemeyer.
He's got to be Slytherin for me, like full throttle.
Yeah.
I guess.
It seems obvious, but we mean that in a complex way, as we do always with these designations. And I think the giveaway for Frank is like the vanity that is extremely clear and has just been sort of like has kind of metastasized into this entire psychotic personality, but it's at root it's just vanity and self-obsession, even his exploration of his own inner state
and a desire to sort of gain like some sense of notoriety even in his own mind.
Exactly.
Like
Yeah.
even in his own death, he like is sort of obsessing about the ways that he's different than the other prisoners, and he wants to be treated specially, and like he hopes he doesn't get shot in the same place that everyone else does. Ultimately, he is shot in the same way everyone else is, but
Of course.
that, you know, so yeah.
Right.
I think
Disdain for the poor, and that it's described early, disdain for people who give in, you know, that's more of his like you know, first half of the book kind of concerns, but still, yeah, just like basically like I'm different but I still, you know, but I'm self-obsessed and I still need people to confirm that that's true, but
right.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like a hyper inflated ego with a lot of vanity and being like, I want these certain things out of life. It doesn't necessarily mean that like him killing people it makes him Slytherin, because Hufflepuffs can kill people and rape. So it's more about the hyper ambition aspect of him,
Right.
for me.
All houses can murder for sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
And rape. It's, you know, it's just
And be generally the worst.
and yeah, and just be monsters. Every
Or the
house has
best.
that.
Or
The best.
Who's
There's a
gonna win? Who's gonna win? Who's gonna lose?
Look,
Okay, what about Frank's mother, Lotta? Definitely Slytherin also. She's terrible.
yeah,
And she's
yeah.
a coward.
she's a fucking coward, dude. The problem is with this is that like the conniving aspect of this world makes Slytherin easy seeming clap for every
Who's not a
Yeah.
fucking Slytherin in this book, honestly?
sissy.
Sissy's definitely not. But what is she? Do we even know?
Sissy,
puff.
Bertha, some of the prostitutes are not, I would say.
I would say
Yeah.
Sissy's a Hufflepuff.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Sissy's
I think
a
that-
Hufflepuff.
I
But
think-
she ultimately is still loyal to Frank in this weird, sick way.
Right.
I would say that Bertha is we don't get much out of Bertha, but I think she's a Gryffindor because she stands up for herself and like fights with Frank, gets slapped around, and she speaks her mind in a way that Hufflepuff would not. So
Yeah.
What about what? Yeah.
I just agree.
And then she leaves the house.
Right? Yeah.
yeah, Gryffindor.
What
Maybe
about
the one Gryffindor?
I think Holst is a Gryffindor.
Yeah, actually, I think Holst is a Gryffindor too. Yeah.
Yeah. There's something Chad about him.
Yeah, he's deeply Chad.
Yeah.
Holst reminds me of one time when I was a kid. I'm not going to get into it, but I did something really mean and I made someone cry.
Oh,
and their dad came to my house and sort of like said, "Listen, son, that was really fucked up and offensive what you did. I'm going to give you a chance to apologize, and I'll shake your hand like a man if you do." And I was like, "I'm sorry," and then it was fine.
Nice. That's
That
I
is
know-
Holst.
I know
That is Holst in a
exactly what you're
nutshell.
talking about, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's what Holst does, and it's very Chad. What about Cromer, Slytherin?
Slytherin, dude, it's easy. Easy
yeah.
Slytherin.
He's
What
like
about-
one of a Malfoy's like little boy henchmen.
Yeah, he's like the worst.
That's Cromer.
But
Yeah.
if those guys were pedos,
Right.
Yes,
Exactly.
which they very well could be later in life.
just the worst Harry Potter fan fiction ever. It's just Malfoy's pedo henchmen as adults. It's terrible.
What would we meet the pedos? That would-
No,
yeah.
God.
No.
The Hufflepedos.
Slitherpede.
Awful.
Who else was prominent?
There was the
What about I don't know. I wrote down the characters. There's Carl Adler, who was the one that like went with
it's just a henchman. They're
Yeah, a
all
lot of
yeah,
these people are
henchmen.
just too
not fleshed
opaque.
out enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Old Wimmer. Yeah, there's not enough. I think that was it.
Those are the
Yeah.
big ones.
Again, like another thing is that like, well, I mean, it was easy to do the Harry Potter characterizations for certain characters, but like intentional opaqueness to character is another kind of intentional aspect of everybody in the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you guys think about this book?
I loved it.
Let's give it.
I'll go last because I was the one that.
I think
picked it,
that's the
right?
tradition. Yeah, the picker goes
Yeah.
last.
Okay.
picker.
You sure want me to go first?
Yeah.
I fucking loved it. I'll just say call me George Simenon because I am a fucking I stand Simenon. I love Simenon. I've loved everything I've ever read by him. So I'm big fan, potentially to the point that it clouds my judgment. But I loved it. I thought this was one of the best novels that I've ever read about World War II, in my opinion. Even though that's not sort of like up front, I think it becomes that. It's like a 4.57 for me.
Yeah, dog. I was about to say 4.4.
Nice. Well, Matt, what's your final thoughts on it before I go?
Just that, you know, it. I've read the things around this book that this book is dealing with in such a more in your like at the jugular, just uncomfortable, cold kind of analysis of this thing. So I feel like some people might feel like there's some sort of like familiarity to this stuff that makes it seem, I don't know. I feel like it didn't get its due, which I think is something that Simenon felt too himself about the book, but that
and his whole career, really,
his whole career was that it didn't get its due as something that should be in the same breath as things like Nausea and the Stranger, which are like world renowned. And this book is, I think, far and away superior to those.
Nice. Well, I think I'm going to give it a 4.65.
Woo!
I really loved it. I'm turning into a major Simenon fan.
Simping on with Gabe.
Simping on, baby.
Instead of a Simenon, I'm a Simon yes, you know?
Oh, you was Simon oui because of the French.
Yes.
Yeah, dude.
I don't know. He blankets the spectrum of just like horrible humanity in such a great way. I wish he was I wish I could transport him in time now and he could write a story about like what's happening now. And it'd be fucking awesome. First 48. It'd be an episode of the First 48 in Cleveland. It'd be great.
You just be pimping him out like Lot to just make like prestige or like murder television.
He would be like, "What are you talking about?
What are you doing? What are you doing?"
Yeah. Well, good book. I loved it. I
had a good time. I mean, I had a bad time, but in the best way possible.
Yeah. Yes, I had a bad time.
Mm-hmm.
I had a great time.
And I hope listeners that you did too.
That's the most important thing, is that the listeners had a good time.
Yeah. You thought we
Just
forgot about you.
Crack open this spine. Simenon deserves a crack.
He does.
Yes. Yeah.
Multiple cracks.
He needs a resurgence.
Definitely, like fully unironically, I endorse what Matt said. This is don't whatever. Everyone's read The Stranger. And Sartre sucks. Sartre was a terrible fiction writer. Don't read it. Read this.
Yes. That is the final say of the Spine Crackers.
Gavel pound. Dun dun. Bye guys. Thank you for listening. We love you. Bye.
Bye.
So many feelings pent up in here. Left alone, I'm with the one I most fear. I'm sick and I'm tired of reasoning. Just want to break out, shake off this skin. I can't escape myself.